Very briefly on the structure, I've tried to keep it extremely simple and bare basic. The idea is to first have a small refresher on Monte Carlo simulations. And so this idea of Monte Carlo is so integral to understanding default risk in fund structure. So it makes sense to first spend time on that. And once we are sure we have spent some time on understanding what Monte Carlo is really about, we can then proceed towards the fund structures. So the Monte Carlo, the reason I'm saying it's a refresher is we did cover it in one of the previous parks. So I'm going to look at a cursory look at it, and then we'll move on to the fund structures. But if you're not able to follow at any point of time, please feel free to interject and ask questions. So just to get everybody a little warmed up and open the session, I would like to project this question and just take a viewpoint of how would we normally, or what are the different types of ways in which we can approach this question. So let's take an example of commute to work, and it consists of your pathway to office consists of something like this. So you drive a certain kilometers, and you'll be able to get a particular speed with a particular probability, and you come to an intersection that has red lights for 10 minutes and then green for 3. The reason I've given red for 10 minutes is because I'm trying to mimic the Taramani signal, and that might also be an underestimation, but still. So travel 1 kilometer, averaging the speed with deviation. So there's multiple ways of trying to project uncertainty. One is you can look at it in terms of a probability way, 20 kilometer with 90% probability. Other is you can look at it in a distribution way. You'll average 50 kilometers with a standard deviation of 10. And if you assume it's a normal distribution, you will be able to have a full curve of what the speeds will look like across different probabilities. You again come to another intersection, and then again you travel for a certain kilometers. And so say your employer has a rule that 95% of times in the month, if you come on time, you don't get a pay cut. But if you if you come 94% of the times on time, 6% deviation, you get a pay cut. So you want to be sure that you arrive to office on time 95% of the times. So how much time should you allocate, to get that probability? So how would we, look at this question? How would we approach this question? I'd be happy to just get any thoughts on it. Yeah, fine. So you take a worst case scenario. So, but on the basis of what?
So on the basis of the 90% probability that you'll be able to average 20 kilometers, I would say put it at 100% that you will only be able to do 20 kilometers, and then assume that the traffic light will always be 10 minutes. In fact, maybe factor in even 11 minutes, and so on.
Okay, great. So we'll just keep that answer in mind. So what Berry is suggesting is we take the worst case scenario among this. So that would mean there's 90% probability you will average 20 kilometers. So you will take that as the worst case. You will take the worst case that you will stop at a red light for 10 minutes. You will then averaging 50 kilometers per hour with a standard deviation of 10. So depending on your comfort level, you can, how much standard deviation away from the mean you want to go, you can take that as the speed. And you again assume that you'll again hit a red light. And you again assume that you will hit a red light and then travel again. So that's one way. Is there any other way of looking at this? I mean, one very simple way would be, okay, I'm traveling from here to Adyar, it takes me this much time. I'm traveling from here to my office. I know the route fairly. I mean, I just know the general visibility of how the route is, and I estimate, okay, it takes me 10 minutes to go to Adyar. It'll take me 15 minutes to reach the office. So that's one way. Is there any? Yeah. So we can simulate it. So how?
So we have log many numbers.
Yeah.
We can take just
Yeah.
So once we get the distribution 90%,
Yeah.
probability will be.
Perfect. So now let's just analyze all of these questions and just try to put it into different buckets. So we had 3 answers here. One is more or less a case scenario building with a worst case approach. We had an answer in terms of doing a simulation. And I had an answer in terms of purely approaching it in terms of from here to Adyar it takes 10 minutes, from here to Taramani, how much time will it take? So my approach is non-probabilistic because I'm taking a point estimate of the time it will take for me to reach office. Perry's and sorry, I don't know your name, Ram. Then. So Ram's approach would fall in the probabilistic case where we are looking at it in terms of probability as in terms of cases. So that's the basic distinction between non-probabilistic and probabilistic approach, and simulation falls in the probabilistic domain of how you approach uncertainty. So if you look at 3 types of approaches, the first one, scenario analysis, you can do a best case, most likely case, and then a worst case, which would be what Berry had suggested. You can do it in terms of a decision tree, a sequential decision. So, you know, you would reach at that intersection, there you can have a red light or a green light. Then you take the red light and you draw another decision tree. So you can map out this entire process in terms of a decision tree. You can look at it in that sense. And you can do a Monte Carlo simulation on this. And the strength for the Monte Carlo simulation obviously is that it's able to combine both scenario and decision tree. And it can focus also on continuous outcomes, not only discrete outcomes. So what we had in your case was discrete outcomes, and in my case was a purely point estimate, so it doesn't even fall under any of this domain. So these are the 3 types of probability. Now, before I come to Monte Carlo simulation, I wanted to understand, is there a mathematical way of solving this? For example, when you roll a die, an unbiased die, you know that the probability of any one number coming is number of favorable outcomes by total outcomes. So that's 1 by 6. I can approach that problem mathematically. I can solve it mathematically. Can this be solved mathematically? There's going to be an integrals across each of these steps. So it's a multi-layer integral problem, and like you said, if you were to approach that way and try to express this relationship in a mathematical function, it would be very difficult to do that. If for some reason you are able to generate a function which captures this process, it would probably be something which is mathematically very difficult to solve. So you'll have so many multiple levels of integrals and differentials to solve this numerical problem that will be very difficult to. That is one of the reasons why people use simulations a lot, is in situations where it becomes so complex to think about something in terms of mathematical terms that there is no other way but to use an actual simulation approach to get an idea. So what really is Monte Carlo simulation? Very, very simply put, if you have 3 variables, say x, y, and z, and these variables are connected to the output, which is A, through some functional relationship. So just to take an example, if x plus y plus z might be equals to A, that's a functional relationship. But if x plus y plus z is equals to A, do you really need simulation to solve this? You don't. You can just add it up. But if the relationship between x, y, and z and A is so complicated that it's difficult for you to even analyze and think about it, then what you can do is, for each x, y, and z, you assume a probability distribution as to what mimics that variable the closest. So say x is, say, rainfall. We all know that rainfall most of the times happen to be the normal, with a deviation that it might be short or it might be in excess. So you can take, say, a normal distribution to mimic x, and you look at the past 100 years, you look at its mean, and look at its standard deviation. Once you have these 2 variables, you can generate a normal distribution and you have your x for that. Similarly, you do for y and for z. So now you have 3 distribution variables which capture 3 different variables in your model. What you then do is you randomly sample from each of these distributions. So when you sample once, that value is put in x, y, and z. It is put through the functional relationship, not in mathematical terms, in actual observation terms. It's put into the functional relationship, and you get an output, which is A. So you record that output. You do it again, take a random sample of these three variables, run it through the functional relationship, and you have your output. Hence, you'll get an output distribution. So what Monte Carlo simulation allows you to do is to transmute uncertainty in model inputs to uncertainty in model outputs. Yeah, so sampling is obviously at the core of the Monte Carlo engine, and one way of, like you said, we could simulate it. The other way of doing a if you don't know Monte Carlo simulation and if you have no idea what it is, one way of solving the question which I asked at the beginning was, for the past 30 days, if you could note down the time that it takes to commute from your place to your office and just make a note of it. And you keep on making a note of it, keep on adding, so you have 30 observations, 90, 100. And at an observation level, you are comfortable. When you have sufficient number of observations, you could actually draw an histogram and just look at how does it look like, over the past year, what does my commute time look like? So you'll have some, when you're leaving from home, you'll have some scenarios in which the traffic is pretty light. You'll have some in which the traffic is very, very dense. So you'll take a lot of time to come to office. You'll obviously have a situation where you might find the roads absolutely free. That's if you're coming to work on a Sunday. And you might have a situation where you have a blown out tire, in which case the time that you take to commute to office would be astronomical. Now the idea behind Monte Carlo simulation, and the mistake which is most often repeated and which is something which we have to all contend with, is the sampling has to be absolutely adequate enough for you to represent that outcome in a representative manner before you actually use any of the results. So if you are sampling and, so this would be a negative black swan event, that would be a positive black swan event. In case your sampling is not able to capture that, so you will mimic the distribution as having very thin tails at the end, when in actually it could have a very fat tail. So again, brings us to the question of how to avoid becoming a turkey. This is an example given by a very famous author, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, on uncertainty. And he says you should never confuse absence of evidence with evidence of absence. So if you take best way to put this example is, if you take an example of a turkey and a butcher, for 1,000 days, the butcher feeds the turkey. That's to get it plump so that he can, kill it at Christmas Day. Sorry. Yeah. So he feeds it for 1,000 days, say. And every single day, if you are observing that event, every single day you will see the butcher feeding the turkey. It will give you an absence of evidence that the butcher does not like the turkey. And the beautiful thing about this is, every single day will reinforce your belief that the butcher loves the turkey. After 1,000 days, on 1,001st day, when he kills the turkey, that's a black swan event. So, just by observing, the idea behind this is, when you are sampling in your Monte Carlo simulator, just if there is an absence of evidence for something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an evidence of absence. And that graph at the end is a very funny way that Taleb depicts this incident. This is how the turkey is forecasting its population explosion. This is the 1,000th day, at which point it reassesses the rate of growth of population in turkeys. Which is just to bring forward to this point that this has to be extremely robust. If there is any problem with those input distribution assumptions, it will become a garbage in and a garbage out model. Yeah, so which is, now we can come to the most powerful thing about a simulator is, it gives the analyst a distribution. And a distribution is such a powerful thing because it captures across its left tail and the right tail the entire gamut of outcomes which any variable can take. And imagine if you have been able to generate this distribution well, using the technique of simulation. The amount of analysis power that you hold in your hands is practically infinite. Because once you have characterized a variable into a distribution and you're sure it's the correct distribution, and you have the parameters of this distribution estimated well, then you can do probably any kind of analysis in terms of risk and uncertainty which you might require. So just to take an example of a normal distribution, we know that -2 standard deviation will have 67% of the observations, minus 3 will have 99%. So you have your full distribution in hand. Okay, so which brings me to a question again. Say if you do this, you are able to mimic your commute to office through a distribution which you believe it to be correct and which you believe will be a normal bell-shaped curve. The beauty about a bell-shaped curve is that most real things in life actually depict a bell curve. So can we give a range for the minute it takes to get to office associated with the 100% confidence interval? Say if you have this distribution, can you say, if I ask you for a range, give me the range that the time it will take me to travel, which has a 100% certainty? No? No? If no, can anybody tell me why?
So it goes from minus infinity to infinity, right? So for
Yeah.
100% it's not possible.
Yes.
For 99.99 it's possible.
Yes. Great. So this this axis, the curve never touches the axis. It asymptotically approaches the axis, but it never touches it. So it's not possible to put a confidence level of 100%, which is just to say that we should be really modest in any estimate which we use. And just to give you an example of what that event might look like, this would be an event where the time taken to commute to office would be infinity. You'll never reach office. So that's supposed to take care of the other end of the distribution. So again, just to touch up on what the origin of Monte Carlo simulator is, and this gives an idea of what was the need for such a technique. So the gentleman on your right hand side is Stanislaw Ulam. He's an American Polish mathematician, and he was a very famous mathematician. We'll come to his substantial contribution in the next slide. But this gentleman fell sick for some period of time, and he was lying on his bed sick and ruminating. And being a mathematician, what he was ruminating was about what are the chances that a Canfield solitaire laid out with 52 cards will come out successfully. So unfortunately, I do not know solitaire. I'm sure many people among here would have played solitaire. So I'm assuming it is some card game where you pluck out the cards and you have to get some favorable sequence. And he was interested in knowing, if I were just to do that randomly, what is the chance that will come out successfully. Now, with any card game, this is again a problem where multiple things lead to multiple levels, and he is a mathematician and he's trying to solve it for a lot of time by combinatorial calculations. So he's actually taking pen and paper and he's trying to solve that equation. He's trying to look at different variables, trying to do the integrals and trying to solve that question mathematically. And he wondered whether a more practical method than abstract thinking might not be to lay it out 100 times and simply observe and count the number of successful plays. So in as plain, simple English, those two last lines capture what a Monte Carlo simulation is about. What he did physically can now, because of computer powers, be done on a computer. So he laid out 100 times simply to observe what is the probability of getting a successful hand. Yes, and so in terms of Monte Carlo, whenever we talk of Monte Carlo, we always think about in terms of computers. But this gentleman here, Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist, he was very interested in knowing during a fission reaction, how does the neutrons transport across the atomic sphere? And he came across the same problem. He said that the way to do this, to estimate it mathematically, is so humongous that it's practically impossible. And this was in 1936. We didn't have computers back then. Not at least the ones will be as powerful as to solve a simulation for you. And he developed this. So it's called a Monte Carlo trolley or Fermion. And what it does is you need to put this on a piece of paper and you need to rotate it based on different drum settings which will tell it what kind of neutron you want to track across the atomic sphere. And you simply just draw this across in the paper and it will give you all the pathways of, which is again saying this is an example of solving a problem by completely bypassing mathematics. So Stanislaw, he was recruited for the Manhattan Project, which led to the creation of the atomic bomb in the US. So there were two things. First is the discovery of this technique, or to see this technique is not new in the sense even Fermi had did it. But to think about it in terms of being able to solve problems which mathematics are very difficult, which mathematics is very difficult to solve. This combined with the birth of ENIAC, which was the first electronic general purpose computer. These two things led to them using Monte Carlo simulator for plugging different numbers into equations and calculating the result for how the reaction for enriched uranium would look like. And again, that was the same problem that they came. Solving the chain reaction through algebraic equation proved out to be quite a nightmare. And I have underlined the last two lines because that is the last particular aspect of Monte Carlo simulator that I would like you to keep in mind, because you generally come across a question, when is a simulation Monte Carlo? Is all simulations Monte Carlo? Or what is it about a simulation that makes it Monte Carlo? There are different ways of using sampling technique for Monte Carlo. One is, to take an example for financial markets, which we are closest to. I'm interested in, say, the stock of Reliance Industries. What would be the daily percentage change in its price tomorrow? So one way of doing that would be, I take the last 5 to 6 year daily percentage change data and tell my simulator, pick out a value from there. So what I'm saying is, for the past 5 years, I know how the stock has moved daily. I want to know what it will move like tomorrow, sample for a value within those 5 years and get me the output. That is not Monte Carlo simulator because it's historical sampling. So what you have done is you have an Excel with the daily change in price across 5 years, and you're just asking Excel to pick up, which is very different from actually describing a distribution which those 5 years daily price change signifies, and then asking Excel to plug a value from there. So systematically plugging in and trying numbers would have taken too long. So this would probably be a situation where, say, if you have a complex chain reaction, and say it consists of 20 variables, and you look at each variable, what are the different values it can take. Then for that particular variable, you put that value. You move to the next variable. If that can take, say, 100 other outcomes, then you will choose one among that. So the amount of simulation, amount of sampling which you'll have to do is, say, 20, the first case, into 100 other outcomes, such into till 20. So that's an infinite number. You cannot do that. What was significant in this case was they chose random numbers into the equations for calculating the results. So this is the aspect of Monte Carlo simulator where you cannot use your own subjectivity in terms of plucking out numbers. It has to be your subjectivity comes in terms of characterizing the distribution which the input variables show, but you cannot use your own subjectivity in terms of plucking numbers into the. So that is one of the reasons why this technique is very close to a purist, purist risk analyst, view of how uncertainty should be looked at. Because once he has characterized the distributions, he is open to somebody criticizing, why did you choose this distribution? But if the distribution assumptions are correct, nobody can fault him for what the output is. It has absolutely no bias from his end. Very quickly, just to talk about the impediments. Yeah, so very easy to say that let's characterize a distribution which depicts a variable. It's very difficult in real life. Just to take an example, you can say that, fine, I expect this company's next 5-year revenue to grow each year at 8%. But if somebody were to come and tell you and say, no, just give me a distribution, give me a distribution which depicts how the next 5 years or 10, 15, whatever years revenue would look like. It's very difficult. It's not easy to do. It can also be very, very time consuming and resource intensive, because once you are building the model and once you run it in Excel can also take a lot of time for you to run those observations. Also, the amount of observations which you can capture, unless you are doing it in the back end of Excel, is limited by the number of rows which Excel has. Benefits, if you are stuck against a complicated, intractable mathematical dilemma, it's something which will help you get past that. And output is a distribution rather than a point estimate. Very simply put in in financial terms, if you're asked to compare two assets, and if I just give you the expected expected return value for that asset, and if you make a choice based on that, that's not adequate. because the higher the asset with the higher expected mean might be an asset which has a very fat tail, so it has a lot more variability attached to it. But if you have an output as a distribution, it gives you an idea to characterize all of that. The pitfalls, as I spoke, it's a garbage in, garbage out model, and this has been particularly a pitfall which has been emphasized a lot post the 2007 financial crisis when all the CDOs got bust. And that's another pitfall. The benefit that the decision maker gets after getting a fuller picture may be more than offset by his misuse of the simulation. Okay, so just to, so that's that. So this benefit that the decision makers may have, this has led to a lot of research. See, because when this technique came about in 1940s and 1950s, it was pretty much used in the project that we described. It was used in biology to track genes and chromosomes and what would be the probability of getting a male child, a female child, if you have a particular DNA combination and all of that. It became particularly very popular in finance during 1970s, where a lot of simulations started going into stock pricing, modeling portfolios. And now when 2007 crisis, you realize that, okay, there's something wrong. There has been a lot of research into identifying what are the situations which permit you to use a simulation, what are the cases in which you should not use a simulation. So these are the 4 characteristics suggested by Rubinstein. He was the first one to notice the proliferation of simulation techniques in finance, and that got him quite worried. And he said, you should use a simulation only when it is impossible or too expensive to obtain data. The observed system is too complex for you to solve mathematically. So even if you have, say, multiple variables and you characterize them through different distributions, and if it's as simple as addition, so if you have your input distribution as normal variable, you add them, the output will be a normal distribution. You don't need simulation to tell you that. So if the functional relationship between variables is something which allows you to impute and get to the parameters of the output distribution, you're just wasting your time if you're using simulation in that case. And it is impossible or too costly to validate the mathematical experiment. So this is a very simple assessment of risk for a single asset. So you can calculate the value at risk, which is what does the bottom 5% look like for this particular asset in terms of how much low, or what is the minimum return, the bottom 5% which this asset can give. If you have, say, an asset and the expected value of that asset assume can be depicted using a normal distribution with a mean of 120 lakhs and a standard deviation of 10 lakhs. And so this is the case that you can immediately say with 95% confidence that it will not drop below 100 and it will not go above 140. So that's the 95% confidence interval, which is two standard deviation below the mean. So that's 20, 100, and then 140. So this is a case where this is all really great. It's for a single asset, doing this is extremely easy. Now let's look at that same example and try to look at it in the case of a portfolio of assets. So let's again assume normality. So for each of these assets, you can characterize its mean value using a normal distribution. It consists of 10 individual assets. The mean varies from 50 to 950, and the standard deviation varies from 5 to 100. So how would we do this? Is there any suggestion as to how would you approach a problem like this? So for a single asset, we could do it through its distribution and clubbing out the. Okay, so this is in terms of the mean variance approach, the CAPM asset pricing model as well as the Markovich framework, which you use value at risk for. If you were to do this using the same approach as you did here, you will need 45 covariances between those 10 individual assets. So for these 10 individual assets, if I were to calculate what is the expected mean, expected value, it's very simple. You look at the weights of those 10 individual assets, multiply it with the expected, with the mean, you get the expected mean. So that's great. So you have the mean for that. expected value of the portfolio. Now, because I've assumed normality and you have the expected mean of the portfolio, you just need one more thing to characterize a normal distribution for the portfolio of assets, which is the standard deviation of the portfolio, which is where all hell breaks loose, because not only will you need the standard deviation for each of these assets, which you will be given, but you have to take these 10 individual assets and make two pairs of from each of the unique pairs from each of those individual assets, which is to say 10 combination 2, so unique two pair combinations of assets. So there are 45 such. So you will need for each of those pairs what is the covariance between those assets, which is which is practically impossible unless you're working on something for which you have excellent data and you're working with something which has maybe 2 to 3 assets. You can do that. So just to take an example for three assets, so if you look at a portfolio return, it will simply be a weighted average. The variance you have for each of the covariances. So you have here the covariance between A and C, you have the covariance between B and C, and you have covariance between A and B. And this formula can be extremely long if it was to be written for the 10 individual assets. So this is really the challenge which comes when you are evaluating risk in a portfolio of assets. And more so when you're doing it in a fund structure which not only is combining assets, but there is a commingling of cash happening inside the structure, which then goes to an investor payout. So just to take an example, if there are 10 bonds, they are combined in a structure which has its own separate cost built inside the model. The interest will be received from there. You will have the payouts for each of those bonds be given to investors based on some internal criteria. Some of it you may retain, for repayment purpose. Some there might be some repayments which you have not forecasted before. There might be reinvestments which you will do. From the interest received, you will take out a default cushion maybe and pay out the rest to the investor. And this is just at a basic minimum. You're not even talking about defaults. What happens if any one of those bonds default? So in this structure, evaluating risk is a major challenge. And as I talked about in the first part of today's session, if you were to look at this in terms of mathematics, it breaks down. You cannot describe a function which will tell you how bond 1, bond 2, bond 3, how the cash flows from that transmutes to the investor return cash flows through a mathematical function. It is impossible to do that. So let's look at how previously some of the techniques which were used for evaluating risks in such kind of structures. So one of the earliest example that I could come across was Moody's binomial expansion technique. This was still the era when you had a mixture of ad hoc and assumptions as well as analog simulations. So I'll just come to the analog simulation part. You did not have electronic simulation at that point of time. So what this we'll come to this little later after we have gone through this. The idea behind Moody's this technique is very simple. I have an original asset pool which consists of say 10 securities. I have to somehow transmute that into a homogeneous and uncorrelated hypothetical asset pool. And the reason why it's uncorrelated is very simple, because the moment you throw in correlations, it will become something which you will not be able to handle. In terms of, like we talked about the 10 bonds, you need 45 covariances. So the idea is, how do I transmute this original asset pool, which will have its own correlations and expected means and standard deviations, into something which is uncorrelated and which brings down, so it's a bit like a representative sampling taking place. So for people who are familiar with principal component analysis in regression, so what you have is you might have 10 variables and you try to get a principal component of that 10 variables so that you can just use that principal component in your analysis, and that principal component is supposed to be a representative of those entire 10 variables. And the way you derive that principal component is you ensure that that component has adequate diversification and variability to account for all the 10 individual variables which it is trying to represent. So the method, it creates a hypothetical portfolio of uncorrelated and homogeneous assets from the original asset pool. The number of assets which you have in this portfolio is termed as diversity score. So if you have a very, very highly concentrated asset pool, the number of securities which you will have in your hypothetical asset pool will be very less. But if you have very, very diversified assets in your asset pool, you will have a very high diversity score. That's because you will have difficulty in clubbing two assets together and representing it together. Now, once you have generated a hypothetical asset pool, this is something called an analog simulation. So this is really a poor man's cousin of Monte Carlo simulation. And what you do in this is, say your hypothetical asset pool has 4 securities. What you will do is you will default this is not default, and you let the others. Actually, sorry, this is just the opposite. You should default one asset and let the others not default. So in this case, asset number 1 is into default. The others are fine. Similarly, in the next scenario, you let this one default, then this one, and then this one. So what you are doing is you are doing an analog simulation. Now, why only one asset is defaulted and not maybe 1 or 2? That is at the discretion of the underwriter, the evaluator, or the credit rater. So what he's doing is he's using internal, his own ad hoc principles of what should be an adequate stress testing, which will give me a good rating for this fund or a CDO. Now, for each of these situations, you can get the present value of the cash flows for that entire fund. So for if the first one is defaulting, you will write off the amount on the first one. You will not take into consideration the interest payments that you receive from it, and you will only take the next into consideration. You will discount it back. You have your present value of the cash flows. Now, for each of these instruments, what you will do is you will observe what the rating is, and say, take an example. Say the first one is rated as AA. You will use a historical default study to understand, for a AA rated instrument, what is the kind of defaults that is generally observed. So for each of these instruments, you will have a default rate associated. Now, once you have a default rate associated for each of these, and you can simulate this, you can characterize this using a binomial distribution, because in a binomial distribution you have number of successes to total trials. So for each of those outcomes, you will have one success here being defined as not default, or success being defined as default. In case you want to do it the other way, you can look at it as success being defined as not default, in which case for each you will have 3. So you have a probability of, so the challenge is, I have a probability of default for each of these. How do I get that into a probability for each of these cash flows which I am generating? We use that using the binomial formula, which is where this technique gets it named wrong. Now what you have is, you have for each of these scenarios, you have the expected value, which is if you have to multiply the present value of cash flows for each of those scenarios by their probability of happening. So for this entire hypothetical asset pool, you will get the expected loss curve, which you compare to the expected loss curve for a benchmark expected loss curve for the SWOT rating. So if the arranger wants a rating of say AA for this asset pool, this expected loss curve is compared to that, and you get an idea of whether the credit enhancement in that structure is adequate or not. So very briefly, just to give a 1,000-feet summary of this exercise, what is happening is you have an asset pool which has n number of securities. You cannot mathematically compute the risk that that asset has. So what you do is you transmute it into something which is much more tractable, which is much more approachable. So you break it down into a hypothetical asset pool, and then follow your normal approach towards risk assessment, because once the correlation is taken out of this hypothetical asset pool, life gets a lot more simpler, because even in this case, what will happen is all of these covariances will become 0. So all those extra covariances term become 0, and it becomes much more tractable. So this is the just in terms of. But if you were to look at this entire approach, is it something which inspires a lot of confidence, or is it something which looks like a black box where a lot of ad hoc stuff? So the question is not whether the ad hoc adjustments which are being made at each and every stage, they are because when you are converting that asset pool into a hypothetical asset pool, so on the basis of what is that being done? As it is, the financial securities data is very, very limited. And so for a rating agency, that's great, but it has tons of data. So you're developing internal heuristics based on which you're going to transmute this. But the entire approach leaves you with a feeling that there's a certain bit of a black box out there, and you don't exactly know what adjustments are being made at every stage. And this has been the most restrictive, this has been the most severe criticisms of this methodology. And anyway, this has been discontinued now. So there are a lot of restrictive assumptions behind this method. And you can use this only when the number of assets are more or less equally weighted, and it has very less number of assets in the asset pool. Again, the correlation factor is reduced to 0 in the hypothetical portfolio, which will have their own sets of challenges. In a situation where the globalized world, probably every asset is correlated to every other asset. Thinking that there is actually a hypothetical portfolio which is totally uncorrelated in its constituents is very difficult. And very ironically, there is an inverse relationship between correlation and diversity score. So the higher is the correlation between the underlying asset pool, the less will be your diversity score. So you will have less number of assets in your hypothetical portfolio. And what has been generally seen is that when the DS, if you look at empirically, there have been a lot of studies in terms of you have analyzed what the rating given by Moody's was and what has been the actual default by those CDO tranches compared to the historical ratings that was achieved by those tranches. And it has been observed that lower is the DS, the more is the error. Starting of starting in 2000, what Moody did was to approach this issue by saying that there will be an upward adjustment to the calculated portfolio default rates based on the weighted average rating of the pool. So whatever is the rating which is generated by this methodology, it is jacked up to account for whatever is the criticisms in terms of no correlation factor being there. So that's the BET method, and it doesn't really, so that's an analog simulation which is not really a simulation, it's more a case-by-case, case-building approach. So let's, before we move on to the next session in which we just look at how S&P has approached this analysis, let's try and answer the question whether we can actually use simulation or not for a case like ours. So it is impossible or too expensive to obtain data. So say if you're doing this for a fund structure, so each of these funds, so the difference between a fund and an SPV, if I were to say, would be something like a difference between a futures and a forwards. So a futures is a much more standardized form of a forward. And for a futures, it is still possible to get data, but for a forward, it's OTC, so it's practically impossible to get any data. Similar is the case with a fund. So for an SPV, say a securitization SPV, it's still possible to get a lot of data because the structures might, I'll be happy to have opinion from the capital team, but the structure is still pretty much something which can be standardized across different transactions. But for a fund, in the case of a fund, it's very, very amenable to change. So simple things like how do you calculate the management fee? You can put a high watermark, you can have a carry. So the structure is very, very different, and it's the structure for a fund also, it progresses based on a discussion with the investor. So the final, across different funds, it can have, there are side letters which the fund goes into with an investor, which change the dynamics of how that fund behaves. So standardization is very, very difficult. That's the reason where you cannot obtain data on historical, how funds have done or how has the default history been. And anyway, this is a private placement market, so public data is anyway not available in terms of public trading. Or the observed system is too complex, as I talked about, the multiple things happening in terms of reinvestments, in terms of defaults, in terms of prepayments, in terms of something being retained by the fund, in terms of management fee. So the observed system is too complex to look at mathematically. The analytical solution is difficult to obtain, which is a corollary to the first part, and it is impossible or too costly to validate the mathematical experiment. So which is to say that if I were to look at the default in a fund, I cannot actually launch a fund 100 times and then see whether it defaults or not. So based on Rubinstein's floor criteria, the use of Monte Carlo simulations for fund rating or the CDO rating appears to be justified. without getting into very technical details, I'll try and, so what I could characterize S&P's rating methodology was, I'll try and explain it in this simple graph. The first thing to notice in this approach is there are two steps in this approach. And in the first step, what you do is you have a model for the assets which you hold in your SPV or in the fund. So you list out those assets, what is the amount of those assets, what are the coupon rates associated with that, and what is the default probability for each of those assets, which is based on the rating of that asset. So for every asset which is rated, you will have an associated default probability, which will be based on the historical studies done by that rater. So you have that as your base from which you start. Then you use a Monte Carlo simulation to see what does defaults look like in this asset. So say if you have 10, for each of those 10 assets, you have an associated default probability. You can simulate that. So the simulation, worst case situation will be all the 10 default, best case will be none of them default, and in between there'll be multiple cases, some default, some not default. What you can also do is you can randomize when does the asset default. So not only is it important whether an asset defaults or not, at what tenure does that asset default. So you could use multiple, it depends on you how you want to approach it. So some people front load the default, some people back end the default. And the best way to do it would be to use a uniform distribution and say at every point of time of the asset, there is an equal probability that it might default. So based on this Monte Carlo simulation, you calculate something which they term as the scenario default rate. So I'll just come to that scenario default rate in the next slide. But what this scenario default rate basically tells you is for this asset pool, this tranche STR is calculated at a rating level. So for, say, if you were to take a tranche for a rating, and if you were to say to the rating agency, I want to get it rated AA. So they will give you a AA tranche SDR for each of those tranches which you have. So senior, mezzanine, equity. Equity is not rated. So senior and mezzanine. Now, what this scenario default rate tells you is what is the amount of default which that fund should be able to withstand to get that rating which you are seeking. To check that, then the cash flow model is run. In the cash flow model, you will actually default the portfolio to the SDR, and you will see whether the tranche commitments can be met or not. So the other way of doing this would be you run the cash flow model and you default the underlying instruments, and then you observe up to what default can my senior tranche still not give way. Can I default the underlying assets by say 20%, and still am I able to meet the commitments of my senior investors? So this is the break-even default rate. That's the rate at which for each tranche, if the break-even default rate is exceeded, the tranche commitment is diminished. So you compare the break-even default rate with the scenario default rate to get an idea whether the credit enhancement is enough or not. So just to we'll take a look at this in a little more detail, but before I move to that, just to summarize again, the idea is to have an indication of what is the level of default which this asset pool should be able to withstand to get a particular rating. In the next step, you check, you run the cash flow model and you check whether, if I default it to that extent, does my tranche commitment still hold or not. So this is the broad framework being adopted by S&P, and what I think is really, I'll skip this slide. It's basically an exposition of what I explained here. But this is, I think, the most beautiful thing which S&P has done in its methodology. It's very, very intuitive to understand. So what I have done out here is I've just taken 10 bonds, rated from BBB to BB in the Indian context. Some of them are 3 years bonds, some of them are 5-year bonds. So for the 5-year bonds, the cumulative default probability across the entire tenure, say 5 to 6 years, would be in the range of about 20%. And for the BB rated bonds, it's much higher, like 25 to 30. So for each of those bonds, you have the tenure and you have some default probability associated with them. Then I have just run a simulation on it for Excel to just default those bonds. And This actually goes up to 100%, but based on the default probability for each bond, that event was so rare that from here it was basically empty access. But it did have some value, but for all practical purposes, we can ignore that as of now. So what the x-axis gives you is the probability of default in the underlying asset pool. Say for 23%, the probability is 80%. So for 33%, it's between 0 and 2%. So for each default rate in the underlying asset pool, you have a probability. Now, so just to put this into context, so if you take your asset pool to S&P, the first thing that they will do is step 1, which is this. What they will do is they will run the simulation and first of all get the distribution of default rates in the underlying portfolio which you have bought to them. Now, say if you tell them, I want to see a rating of AAA for this asset pool. What they will do is for a AAA rated asset, they will look at the historical default rate for a AAA rated asset. Say it is 0.15%. They will do it for the weighted average maturity of this. See the bonds, some of them are tenure 3 years, some of them are tenure 5 years. So the underlying asset pool will have a weighted average maturity somewhere between 3 to 5. So let's say it's 4. So they will say for a 4-year AAA rated bond, preferably from the same sector, what does the default rate look like? So say the default rate is 0.15%. What they will do is they will look at the distribution from this end and they will track what is the default rate in the underlying portfolio which has a probability of 0.15%. So in this case, it is 43%, which is to say that the pool which the arranger has taken to the rating agency, it will default 43%. 43% of that pool will default with a probability of 0.15%. So that's the scenario default rate for AAA rated tranche. So what it means is that if I were to assign that particular tranche a AAA rating, it should be able to withstand 43% default in the underlying portfolio. If it is able to do that, I can confidently say that the probability of this event happening is no greater than 0.15%. Hence, this tranche is befitting to get a AAA rated rating. So, in a way, if you look at it, like if I have an asset pool and if I have this, and if somebody was to ask me what is the rating, of this asset pool, and if you have a tranche structure where this underlying portfolio transmits into multiple tranches, I can get for each tranche, what is the scenario default rate which the underwriter is seeking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So one is this picture, isn't it kind of a strange picture for modeling default, in the sense of you would expect to see much more high probability for small losses and low probability, so you expect to see something like this as opposed to normality.
Yeah.
So one is this just a hypothetical representation, and how suited is it to modeling default?
Yeah.
And the second is, how does the S&P approach address the covariance problem, which we spoke about earlier?
Yeah. So, first of all, in terms of why this is happening, bulk of this scenario is happening out here is the way this has been simulated is for each of those assets, there is an associated probability of default. So, being triple B to double B, what happens is that 20 to 25% of the cases it defaults, which is being transmitted out there. So it's taking a normal distribution approach, where for each of those instruments, whatever is the probability of default, it will gravitate to whatever is the average weighted average rating and the associated default probability to that rating, which is why you see something like this. So the case where the default rates in the underlying portfolio is 1% or 3%. If I were to do this exercise for a AAA and a AA rated instrument, the underlying pool, if I were to simulate it, I will probably have a graph where it will look like this, because the default, 11% of the portfolio defaulting, it might be very common for 11% of the portfolio to default, and it will taper off from here, which is the default. As I keep on increasing the default rates in the underlying portfolio, it will taper off. So here it tapers off at about 47. There it will taper off, much more towards the y-axis.
And this includes ratings like across the board from AAA plus to.
No, so this one is only triple B and double B. So this is just triple B and double B, and what are the default rates and the probability associated with that. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of if you look at this now, once you have got the scenario default rate for each tranche, what you do is in your cash flow model, this can be something. You don't actually also need a Monte Carlo simulator for this. Very plain would be you take an underwriter's cash flow model and say I am checking for a AAA rating, so it's 43%. I will default 43% of the holdings, and I will then whatever is the cash flow that is generated, I will compare that with what do I have to pay to a senior transaction holder, and if that is adequate, then it is worthy of a AAA rating. Otherwise, it is not. So just just very briefly in terms of this methodology. First of all, it is a bit of a complicated model, because you need to build two separate models to do this exercise. And the CDO model is something which is much more difficult to arrive at compared to the cash flow model. So for the cash flow model, you can have your cash flows generated for each of those assets, and it might be a simple case that is summing across the cash flows for each of those bonds. If you have the cash flows for each of the bond, getting the cash flow for the model might not be a huge challenge. But for the CDO model, in which you are simulating the defaults, that's where most of the complexity comes, because there are a lot of questions which you as an analyst can do in that. So like I told you, it's not only adequate to first default those underlying assets. You can also model for when does a default take place, and its case in an amortization structure. If you backend the default, you will get much better results. The second thing is you can model for recoveries. So when does the recovery happen after the default has taken place? Does it happen right at the time of the default taking place that you go and negotiate with the lender, or does it happen more towards the back end? So through the subjective inputs, you can really actually get an STR which might be favorable to you. And in breaking it up into two steps, so there have been some studies which have suggested that this is something which S&P has actually an inbuilt tool which they sometimes also share. You can when we were discussing for our fund, this was generous of them to actually share with us how they get the scenario default rate, the entire model. This is something which they refuse to share. This is something which they say is very proprietary to them. And this is developed in close association with the arranger, because it is assumed that the arranger has excellent understanding of how the cash flows in the transaction will look like. And this has led to a lot of questions in terms of the rating team, developing in such close association the underwriting model with the arranger. It leaves open questions. And the second thing is you can compare the scenario default rates to the break-even default rates only if the assumptions across both these models are the same. If there is even a slight variation, in any of these assumptions, this and this will not be really comparable. Finally, which brings me to the last piece of today's session, which is just to say that if you were to try and do this yourself, sitting on your computer, and forget the Moody's binomial expansion technique. Even at the first step, you don't know how to proceed, because how do I convert these multiple assets into a hypothetical portfolio of uncorrelated assets? Leave aside the S&P's approach, where you have to build a CDO model, underwrite a cash flow model, get the STRs, and And if you were to just approach this as to, how can I, in something not being a rating agency myself, right? How can you approach this in an intuitive way, in a simple way, so that you don't practically have to master all the risk analytics which a rating agency, which is spread across a huge team and across a global. And to think that to be able to replicate something which they are doing is a challenging task, because they are supposed to be the specialized entities which do this. But does that mean that we're pretty much clueless in terms of how to evaluate risk, and for us to look at risk for this asset pool, we need to necessarily approach a rating agency and take it for granted that what they are saying is true? That need not necessarily be the case. I think we believe that there is something which you can do at your end which is much more intuitive, just to give you an idea of what is the risk that is there in this particular fund or in this particular CDO. And for that, we can approach it like this, which is much more simple than what we have seen. And in fact, it will be a subject of research to see how well this output from this compares to the output from the S&P model, or it could be something like we take historical transactions, run it past this methodology and see what is the rating that is generated, and compare it with what do we get here, and are they both same or not? And I'd be happy to hear what your suggestions are. So the way to do this is, first of all, not to split. So this is a consolidated model, which is to say it consists of both the cash flow model and the CDO model. So without getting into the technicalities, it's fairly simple. You have an Excel, you have a sheet, you write down say if you have 10 bonds, you put down those 10 bonds, you map the cash flows for each of those 10 bonds, you sum it up, that gives you the cash flows for your entire model. And then based on whatever tranche you are creating, you can split that cash flow. So say, whatever is the cash flow, first give the senior investors return X, say 10%. So it gives 10% to the senior holders, then the balance comes to, say, equity holders, just to keep it very plain and simple, just a senior tranche. And so say you do that. So nothing rocket science, simply you have taken all the bonds which you have mapped their cash flows across, say, whatever is the tenure, and you're summing it up and then breaking it down into different tranche scenarios. So for each of those bonds, what you do is you can randomize the default. So assuming that each of those bonds have a rating, so if it's a AA rated bond and it's a 5-year rated bond, the tenure is 5 years, you can assume a particular, based on the historical default studies, you can assume a particular cumulative default probability that it will have. And you do that for each of those bonds, and you simulate it, you randomize it. And what Excel does is it will keep on randomizing it. In some scenarios, all of them will default, some 2, 3. So you get the cash flows for each of those simulations across, say, 10,000 trials which you do. Now for each of those trials, it will have broken down the cash flow into the tranche cash flows. So you just need to record it somewhere. It can be done through, again, a data table in Excel. Now, what you do is then you compare that in those 10,000 cases, how many number of times was I able to meet the commitment which I had given for a particular tranche. So say out of, just to take a simple number, out of 100 cases which you did, you were able to meet the tranche commitment 95% of the times, which is to say that 5% of the times the fund defaults, which is to say that the probability that I will have a default for a particular tranche is 5%. So this is a way of doing this, and I'll be happy to have anybody's comments with respect to what they think this methodology really means. So basically what you're doing is you have cut across all the ZAS. What you're simply doing is you have a portfolio of assets, you know their default characteristics, you're modeling it, consolidating the cash flows, splitting it into tranche, and then observing, for each tranche whether I was able to meet the commitment or not. It's a simple flag. You need to record the number of times the commitment is met. That will give you, whether how many times out of the number of simulations which you have done, you can meet the tranche commitment. And if you were to compare this method with this approach, the primary difference is you'll be using the historical default rates. So, when you have a case of say a 5% times you're unable to meet the tranche commitment, you will look at a default study to say what was the rating which is associated with a 5% default over this tenure, and you will impute that rating to a tranche. So we got a chance to put this across to Standard & Poor also as to why is this not done, and why is something like this done rather than something like that, something like the consolidated approach. And we got multiple responses, not all of them we're entirely clear about. The first is, for us, fine, it's a simple fund structure, and doing something like this might do the trick. But for a very, very complicated model, so you can have a CDO square where the cash flows from a senior tranche of a particular CDO is going into another CDO which has another tranche, and you can have CDO cubes also. So there are 3 levels of CDO transactions, not unheard of, because in the global financial crisis, a lot of transactions, it was practically impossible to go back and see how was the risk arrived at. There was so many layers of credit enhancement in between. So if you have a structure like that, and if you were to try to do something like this, it will fall apart, because the cash flow model for that will be so complicated, and even if you were to build it, simulating it will be such a time-consuming and resource-intensive process that it will not be feasible. Hence, what is done is this 2-step approach is taken, where what they have done is they have standardized their CDO model, which is to say that they have a standard tool which you can input, the securities in that. You can input the default probabilities. That tool will run and give you the tranche STRs. And the second part, which is the cash flow modeling, that is done separately. So you have broken down a complex process into 2 steps to sort of make it more manageable and tractable. So like everything in life, there is a trade-off. So yes, you have split it across 2 tables, two steps. But what this also means is that it is open to accusations that does the model properly correspond to the underwriter's cash flow model or not. So these are the steps which I had elaborated for the consolidated approach, where what you do is you make use of, so this is the one given by CRISIL, 2012 default study, where for each of those ratings and for the tenure of the instrument, they have given what the cumulative default rates are. So in case in your simulation, default instances, you find that, say for a 3-year period, 6.91 or maybe 7% times, you're not able to meet the default commitment. So you can impute the rating as being somewhere close to that. It might not be very accurate, but what it can at least do is to tell you what is the kind of risk that I should be able to see. Now, this is the last slide. So what is at stake is, and what got me interested in this entire business of rating was, I happened to come across this study, and so the source is mentioned here of the entire paper, but what really got my attention was to just see this graph, and tells you the enormity of the problem that we are facing, where this is a study done by the authors, and they compared what the collateral ratings are for the CDO transactions which were done in the US previous to the global financial crisis, and what was the CDO rating given on a consolidated basis for that asset pool. And if you see, these are dollar houses, so we are a huge number, like 50 billion actually. So a huge chunk of BBB rated collaterals being converted to sovereign rated AAA rated instruments. So this is the CDO rating for the senior tranche. So by some magical process, we have been able to convert these instruments into a sovereign rated instruments, and this is the not rated part. So that would probably be the equity tranche, which would probably be the credit enhancement which this entire rating is dependent on. And very aptly, the authors have put the title of this paper as The Alchemy of CDO Ratings, because frankly this looks something which is not possible. So what is at stake in terms of this entire default risk estimation is getting a hang of what's really happening and trying to come as close to what the risk actually is of investing in a particular fund. So this brings me to the close. I'll be happy to have any questions.